and PhD in Signal and Image Processing from the University of California, San Diego. Currently, he is a lecturer at Columbia University and an adjunct professor at the Fordham Gabley School of Business. He has worked for over 15 years in the industry for Fortune 500 companies such as Roche, Genentech, Qualcomm, HP Labs, NVIDIA and MERL on several machine learning and computer vision research and development projects and products. He has also worked for and consulted for over a dozen startups in the analytics space. He is also a fascinating individual, and we are grateful for his presence among us today. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Vikas Ramachandra. Sir, the stage is all yours.
Thanks, Ganesh. Hello everyone, this is Vikas. I want to keep this interactive, so I'm going to present some slides, but feel free to ask questions along the way. I don't want this to be a one-way conversation. Let me get started, but before that, if people had any questions, I'm happy to answer them before I get into the technical side of things. If not, I'll just share screen and get started.
So on the right hand side, you'll see two buttons. One will say chat and one will say questions. These two will be the tabs which are used by all the people to ask you any questions. Vedant, you can ask them in the questions tab, yes. So I don't think there are any questions at this point in time, sir.
Okay, I'm just sharing my screen. Okay, I think you should be able to see my screen now.
Yes, it's visible.
So I went to BITS Pilani. I did electronics and instrumentation, and then I moved to the US. I got my master's and PhD in image and signal processing from UCST. Did a lot of machine learning type work. So my main focus there was on computational imaging, and since then I worked at Qualcomm for about 6 years. Also worked at NVIDIA and Mitsubishi and so on. Mainly looking at computational imaging. Again, I'll share some slides. So looking at images, trying to build computer vision and machine learning algorithms. And I'll walk through some of that very briefly. Again, like I said, I would want to keep this more interactive and open to questions and so on. So I'll just quickly go through some of my previous work, mainly in the computer vision and imaging space. But then just to continue my journey, for the last 7 years or so, I've been working in the medical imaging sector. I've been looking at radiology images, mainly X-rays, for cancer detection, both on mammograms as well as lung nodules and so on. And more recently at Onward Assist, we are looking at pathology images, so looking at cell detection, cell classification, segmentation and so on, to detect different types of cells on pathology images, and then also try to correlate that with genomics and clinical outcomes for patients. And again, I'm guessing that the audience has a pretty diverse background, so I won't get into a lot of details. But mainly my technical talk would be around something known as causal inference, and I'll get into that in a few minutes, and how we can use machine learning, and that has a lot of applications on the side of basically healthcare analytics. But before that, let me quickly jump into some of the previous work I've done, mainly at Qualcomm and elsewhere. In the computer vision space, like I mentioned, my main theme of work has been in computer vision and medical imaging, other than machine learning as well. So this is some of the work I did on structured light and depth sensing. Mainly the idea is when you have two cameras or you have a projector and camera system, you can reconstruct the 3D depth map, which would essentially be useful for a number of applications. And some of the applications basically we have is gesture recognition, and also detecting the 3D structure of your face and so on. So it is being used, some of this is being used in products on cell phones right now, mainly for 3D facial detection, recognition, as well as biometrics. So, for example, you can unlock your phone when you put your face in front of the phone. Right? It identifies your 3D face structure, detects your face, and unlocks the phone. Some of the other applications would be gaming systems such as set-top boxes and so on TVs where it can identify and recognize gestures. So a structured light system is very similar to a two-camera system. In a two-camera system, basically you have a left and a right camera, and it looks at the 3D scene from slightly different angles. And based off of that, based on the object distance, so you have multiple objects in the scene, right? So based off of the distance of the object from your camera setup, the two cameras would register the object separately. So there would be a shift. It's very similar to your left and right eyes when you look at an object in the 3D world in front of you. When you close your left eye and you open your right eye and vice versa, there is a shift, which is basically a horizontal shift when you look at the two images on your left and right eye. Similarly with stereo cameras, here the idea is to replace one of the cameras. So instead of two cameras, you have one projector and the camera, which is a receiver. And the idea is you know what you're projecting. So what you're projecting would be similar to light patterns, which I show on the left top image here. And in this case, these were lines with short dashes and long dashes and so on. This is a system which we built in-house at Qualcomm. So the idea was, you know what you're projecting, and then you receive the same scene, the same dots and dashes, but then it would intercept objects in the scene and you would receive it. So depending on the different objects and their depth or the distance from your system, you would have basically what's known as disparities or different shifts. And the idea is then to use what you have transmitted and what you have received to reconstruct the depth map. And what you see on the right image are the reconstructed depth maps here. And again, I won't get into details, but we had our own way of calibrating using a flat plane and so on, and you reconstruct good fidelity depth maps. And what do you do with these depth maps? So the idea is then you can do gesture recognition, and these are some old slides. We did some modifications to this, but whatever is in the public domain, I can share that with you. So the idea is on the right side, you reconstruct the depth map here, and I'm holding up two fingers here. So the idea is going beyond the depth maps, right? Can you do gesture recognition? So, and what are gestures? Gestures are typically with the hand, you can show up one finger, or you can do an opening and closing of a fist, or you can hold up multiple fingers and so on. So, one of the things is, for example, you can do an air swipe. An air swipe versus opening and closing of a fist could say close a menu or bring an object from the background to the foreground. If you hold up two fingers, it could be changed to channel 2 and channel 3 and so on, right? So the idea is then to identify these hand gestures from the depth maps. So on the right top, you see on the right top panel, on the leftmost image, you see that this is the whole depth map which is reconstructed of the scene. You can see my arm and you can see two fingers held up. The next step is to actually detect these fingers by using machine learning. So you can essentially sweep across the full depth map and look for a pattern which is similar to your arm or your hand. And once you detect that, basically we use some contour detection as well as peak detection on the contours to detect how many fingers you're holding up on your hand. Right, so it's a multi-step process. The first step is to reconstruct the depth map, and then from that you detect the number of fingers, basically by detecting the hand, and then you count the number of fingers on the hand. Right, so basically it becomes detection and then a classification. Once you have detected the hand, you want to actually identify what type of gesture the hand is doing. Right, so that's the application we had in mind for the set-top boxes. And similarly, we had similar applications when basically all of you are using smartphones and you have touch screens. But then the idea was when you have a really large screen, you can do something similar, but you don't really have to touch the screen. Let's say you have a very large panel which is like a wall display. So the idea is you put cameras at the corners of the screen, and then you move as you start moving your finger towards the screen and touching it, you can essentially identify different gestures even before you touch the screen, right? So you can call it 3D depth, or basically detecting the hand gestures even before you touch the screen, but as you get closer to the screen, you can detect multiple hand gestures here. And again, this becomes a detection and then a classification problem. I'll skip through this. These are some more details, and again, I want to just keep it high level. So basically, we detected different patches and then trained random forest classifiers to detect different types of gestures and multi-finger gestures on the screen. This is some work which I did on stereo cameras. Like I mentioned, we used a structured light system, but we also developed stereo cameras on cell phones. And the idea is to calibrate these phones. So you have two, essentially two cameras on the cell phone, and they're not aligned. So the idea is, can you do calibration and align the two cameras? And then basically beyond that, can you detect 3D point clouds? Can you detect where each object is in the scene? And for the calibration, basically we had a calibration chart which we built in house, and then you detect the grid points, and then based off of the grid points in 3D, this is a 3D chart, right? You have two charts stuck to each other at 90 degrees, so it's in 3D, and then you detect multiple points. You know the ground truth in the sense that you know where these points are in 3D, and then you have the projections of those on the left and right cameras, and basically you solve for a projective transform which would then map the left and right cameras and make them parallel, those images parallel to each other in software. So this is post processing. And once you have that, basically, then you can detect basically multiple objects by grouping together the disparities or the disparity maps. So you get a 3D point cloud, which is very similar to a 3D depth map. And we had some techniques to build smooth depth maps. Again, I won't get into this, but then basically we had some constraint optimization where you're looking at the reconstructed 3D point clouds and then you're smoothing on top of that to reconstruct high quality depth maps. Right, so this was all about 3D point clouds and depth map reconstruction and different applications such as gesture recognition and so on, both from stereo cameras as well as basically using structured light systems. And one of the examples of structured light systems is Microsoft Kinect. We've used it. We built our own in-house at Qualcomm, but we had basically other projects around the same. So for the last 7 years or so, I've been looking at more medical imaging systems, and I'll quickly skip through some of this to get to that in a minute. So basically, these are some lung nodule images, and the idea is from the lung nodules, can we detect basically from the chest X-rays? The idea is, can we detect lung nodules? And what are lung nodules? So lung nodules are typically cancerous type of indications which you see on an X-ray. And what's the main idea here? The main idea is when the patient goes in, they have X-rays taken, and the idea is, can you detect and score? So basically, can you detect these lung nodules on these chest X-rays, and can you also quantify in terms of the confidence how well you detect them as well as how risky they are? So is the lung nodule 100% risky or is it 50% risky and so on? And the idea is to use object detection frameworks for this. Some of the earlier object detection frameworks are called RCNNs, and more recently there are other techniques such as YOLO, and there are detectrons and detectron 2 and so on. So the idea is you train a machine learning model, you pass annotated images to that, and by annotations I mean radiologists look at these X-rays and they look at basically biopsy results or they look at CT scans and they mark. So the red boxes here are where the radiologist actually marked based on their expertise and training where the lung nodules are. And then we use basically an object detection framework. You can use TensorFlow or PyTorch, it doesn't matter. But the idea is then you use this to train the model, the machine learning model, to detect and classify these local regions on the chest X-rays, which are lung nodules. And then here we are showing the results where on the green you have the model results, and on the red you have the radiologist annotation. So we are actually seeing that the model performs reasonably well in detecting some of the lung nodules. Sometimes it also detects some of the difficult nodules which are missed by the radiologist, which are shown in green, but you don't have the red marks from the radiologist. Sometimes we don't do too well as well, so obviously we need to train this with multiple iterations, with multiple, essentially multiple annotations from the radiologist. And similarly, you can do something similar in the mammogram space. I'll show you some examples here, where in the mammogram space you have something called microcalcifications and you have masses. I'm zooming in, and the red box is given by the radiologist, and this is used for training, and then basically the algorithm returns the result where it's detecting the microcalcifications. You can see these are some tiny dots on the breast, and these are very hard to detect, and the radiologist spends a lot of time going through the whole X-ray image and trying to detect these. So the idea is to use machine learning AI to do a good job at detecting these microcalcifications using object detection. And because the algorithm is trained on hundreds of thousands of images, it does a reasonably good job with accuracies over 90% in detecting these calcifications. There are some other examples here where we built this algorithm and deployed it, where you can see that these are calcifications, and the radiologist has marked this with a red box, and it's trained. The algorithm is trained with this, and you see that the algorithm is doing a pretty good job at detecting the local region of interest, where you say the microcalcification exists. The radiologist is saying this, and then the algorithm is doing a pretty decent job at detecting this. Right? And these are some examples where it's not doing a great job, and then you have again some examples where we are doing a reasonably good job at detecting microcalcifications. These are one type of cancer which show up on breast cancer, on the breast images. So and these are pretty small, and you can see that these have certain patterns in them. They're bright, and these are like small pebbles in the breast at a localized region. And the idea is to help the radiologist in detecting and quantifying this. And the aim is to combine the algorithm along with the radiologist read to improve the accuracy of breast cancer detection on X-rays. One of the other big issues is the radiologist actually has a lot of false positives. And when I say false positives, they are not doing a great job at actually detecting cancer on normal patients. So when you have a lot of normal patients coming in, the radiologist does not such a great job and calls a lot of those as cancer, and they end up sending a lot of normal patients to unnecessary biopsies. So the idea is when you combine the algorithm, which doesn't call a lot of the normal patients as cancer, so it doesn't have a lot of false positives essentially. So combining the algorithm, the machine learning technique along with the radiologist read can help reduce the false positives. And at Onward Assist, we are doing something similar in the pathology space, where you have pathology images. If you look on the left, and basically the idea is to detect these cells, which are cancer cells, on pathology images. So if you look at the workflow, typically the patient comes in, and then the patient basically goes through radiology or X-rays and then CT scans. And when they can't really, or when they're suspicious about what it is, on the X-ray or the CT scan, they send the patient a biopsy. Biopsy is invasive. They basically put a needle and extract some tissue, and from the tissue, basically they build up a pathology image. And from the pathology image, they can say whether it's cancerous or not. And some of the research work we have done at Onward Assist here basically is to look at these pathology images and detect cancer and label them. And some of the techniques we have used are semi-supervised learning, where we use GANs and so on to basically label a lot of the unlabeled images, and also use expert annotations coming from pathologists. And the idea is you have a lot of images. It's difficult to get annotations from pathologists because it's time consuming, and also you need them to look at a lot of images. They're pretty busy actually looking at cancer images for their practice. So the idea is to use machine learning techniques such as GANs, which can look at some labeled images and look at some unlabeled images, and build semi-supervised learning where you can actually then use the GAN or the algorithm to label many of these unlabeled images as cancer versus non-cancer, and then use that. So how is this used in practice? So the pathologist looks at these images, and these are very huge images. The pathology image is 100,000 by 100,000 pixels, and the idea then is for the pathologist, when they look at it under the microscope, they take several minutes to sometimes like an hour or 2 hours to detect local regions which are cancer, and they have to actually count the number of cells on them, which is very tedious. So the idea is when you have this trained algorithm, it can detect and count cells and return heat maps around the detected cells, so you can call it cancer versus benign. And it also does a cell count. Beyond that, it also detects the cells, the shape of the cell for multiple cells, and extracts moments, area, and so on for individual cells. And why is this important? Because this information is combined in the local tissue regions for the pathologist, and they give different grades for the cancer for the patient. And so the idea is when we use the algorithm, it can actually speed up the process for the pathologist, because they spend several minutes detecting the cancer region on the basically the pathology image here. Basically, you can look at isolated cells and basically then they have to count how many of these cells have cancer and so on. So by using the algorithm along with the pathology or the pathologist read, you can save their time, but you can also improve the accuracy of their read, and you can do better staging and grading for patients who have cancer. We have looked at breast cancer and prostate cancer for this, but this can be extended to other types of cancer as well. Yeah, any questions so far on what I'm presenting? I'm happy to answer those. If not, I'll get into some of the other themes of work I worked on, specifically causal inference modeling and using machine learning to do causal inference. But I can pause at this point and answer any questions. Okay, I see some questions here, so let me pause here. The first question is, in medical images, the resolution is high and acquiring more details and textures. Do you recommend transfer learning from an optimized model? So yeah, so there has been some work on this, and I think a few years ago, people trained their own models, and I think at that point there were not a lot of medical images. I think that has improved over time. So some of the, I would say the short answer to this is yes, start with an ImageNet or a trained model, and then unfreeze some layers, and then do transfer learning on that if you don't have a lot of images in your medical domain. So if it's CT scans or if it's X-rays and you don't have a lot of images, maybe you have like maybe just 500 images, then I would suggest doing transfer learning. If you have maybe 2-3,000 images, then I would say actually spend the time getting annotations from radiologists or pathologists, and actually do some transfer learning, but unfreeze more layers then, so you can actually do better domain adaptation. You can actually use better information from your medical images. Yeah, I do agree that there is some commonality in terms of the low level features between natural images and medical images, but beyond that, your X-ray image is very different from your natural image of a cat and a dog. So I would say spend more time annotating and curating your medical images if you have more images, by getting more experts to label them and use those. But start off with transfer learning. Okay, let me look at what are some of the branches where object recognition would be used in healthcare. So yeah, so some of the other applications I've looked at, it doesn't have to be just cancer. For example, in surgery videos, people want to detect different objects, because in surgery videos, they actually, when you're doing surgical, basically robotic surgery, right? When you have the surgical video feed, which is going live to the surgeon, they want to detect things like what are the different instruments which you have inserted in the patient's body. Does the patient have a pacemaker? Is there basically the different organs, right? So are you looking at a kidney? Are you looking at different blood vessels? So object detection is really useful when you're doing robotic surgery as well. And some of the other areas, for example, object detection and chest X-ray analysis is actually being used with COVID right now, because COVID typically they do initial X-ray screening or they do CT scans, and you're looking at different indications which show you whether the patient may have COVID or not. So it shows suspicious areas on the chest X-ray or on the CT scan, which can be indicative of COVID. So that is, I think, very important as well. So if you have object detection techniques, it can detect these indications which are indicative of COVID or not. And similarly for pneumonia and other types of indications on the chest. Similarly, you can look at other organs as well. And on the pancreas, you may have fatty liver disease on the liver, and similarly on the pancreas, you may have fat buildup and other types of problems which can be basically useful to apply object detection on. So it's not just cancer, but a lot of the object detection is on the medical imaging side. Okay. Another question, sir. Had the AlexNet paper not been released or recognized, which innovative research idea would have shaped the future of computer vision and object detection? So again, I think the time was right, to be honest. AlexNet was one of the seminal early papers, but then you have VGG and you have a bunch of other CNN type models, right? So I think convolutional neural nets I think multiple things converge. So when I went to graduate school, we were doing a lot of feature extraction, feature building, and then building classifiers such as SVM and random forest on top of that. Eventually, I think over the years, especially in this decade, I think 2005 onwards, there was a lot of academic research in neural networks, CNNs, but you also had a lot of improved computational power to run better neural network models, to run models which have larger depth and so on CNNs. So I think the whole idea of the CNN itself, the convolutional approach, as opposed to using dense models, I think that came into play, and then also the computational resources improved. So I think a combination of these two was really useful in accelerating the use of CNNs and neural networks on the image classification and object detection side. So even if it had not been for AlexNet, I think just the whole framework of using CNNs to do better classification took off around that time, because you had a lot more data, you had a lot more images, curated images with labels, you also had more computational power with GPUs and so on. So I think it was convergence of multiple things which led to the explosion of deep learning, I think, in the last few years. So that was just my opinion, of course. What would have happened, it's hard to say, but I think I would still strongly feel that deep learning would have taken off. If not for AlexNet, there would have been other models. Eventually, I think the time was ripe for computational models and heavy computation because of the GPUs and so on, and the cloud infrastructure really building up in the last few years, and also a lot of annotated images in the commercial space as well. Okay, so the next question is, for computer vision aspirants, what are some of the techniques and research papers that you think one needs to analyze for developing the intuition to make state-of-the-art models? Yeah, I think this is a great question. I would suggest actually looking at the conferences, right? So looking at ICCV, ECCV, CVPR, looking at conferences such as Neuro IPS and so on, and looking at some of the recent papers, and also looking at papers which are solving specific problems in your domain, right? So if you're looking at specific image sets, so you may be looking at satellite imagery, or you may be looking at medical images. So I would say read the latest research in that field, but also look at general research happening in computer vision. For example, people are using transformers more recently, right? Or they're looking at explainable models in computer vision. So I think all these are really interesting. Recently, I came across this paper which is trying to use shapely values to see how different data points are interesting or useful in the training set. One of the other research areas is basically data drift, or basically how the data varies from one source to another. Because a lot of the times, what I've seen in machine learning or deep learning is you build your model from data coming from one or two sources, right? Especially in the medical domain, it may be coming from one or two hospitals, and then basically you build your model from one or two hospitals. But then when you deploy the image analysis model or the deep learning model, let's say for nodule detection, right? Like the examples I showed you, in a third hospital in a different location, it actually doesn't work very well, because the data distribution actually changes from one data source or one location to another. So how do you build models which are robust to this, right? Or can learn as you go along. It can learn what are the differences in the distribution from one hospital to another or one location to another, and gradually improves its performance over time. So you can think of active learning or reinforcement learning, where it's being intelligent or smart enough to adapt to the change of the data distribution from one source to another. I think that's one of the important directions as you start to put some of these machine learning models or deep learning models in production. How do you actually deal with the data changing over time, or data changing from one location to another? How can the model actually learn this, or can post-processing modules actually figure this out and improve the model over time? I think that's one of the very important aspects one needs to focus on as you become a machine learning practitioner. Okay, let's see some other questions here. So how many times getting labeled data sets in a particular field of interest is tough? Do you support learning, active learning? Yeah, This is again a good question. So it is definitely tough. In the sense it's time consuming. So tough for two reasons. So one is getting experts in the field, getting their time is difficult. And also I think in some domains actually if you look at the so-called experts, there is a lot of variation from one expert to the other. So I think it is important to pool data from one expert to the other. So you need to build a good annotation framework. There are some open source annotation frameworks like Labelbox and LabelMe, which I think is helpful for some domains, but I think for some of the other domains you may need to build your own annotation framework. I think pooling information from one expert to the other across annotations is important. But I would say definitely it is important to focus on that. You can look at public data sets. I think more and more there are a lot of annotated data sets as well as code which people are putting out in the public domain. So that is definitely useful to get started. And then I would say collect your own data sets. It takes time and effort, but I think it's definitely valuable because at the end of the day, garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you collect enough good quality data and assess the quality of the data and collect good enough annotations, then it really would help you later down the line as you build more deep learning models. Okay, I think there's one more question here. For learning AI ML techniques and making practical projects, do you recommend a top-down approach, fast AI, or the bottom-up approach, like conventional courses, like Stanford CS229 or Harvard courses? I would actually suggest basically learning all the all the mathematical frameworks and the details of these models, because I think right now it's very easy to just pick up somebody else's model and run it and get some decent results. But I think to get an intuitive and a fundamental understanding, you need to understand things like backpropagation, you need to understand gradient descent. So I would suggest actually learning all the mathematics, all the statistics, all the different details behind the machine learning models. Because I think since you are students and you want to get into the industry, what will set you apart is not just that you can pick up some code on GitHub and run it, right? Anybody can do that. I think what is really interesting for me, let's say I'm hiring a machine learning engineer or a data scientist, how you can stand out is if you can show me that you have good fundamentals, and good fundamentals could be linear algebra, that you can just explain linear regression to me. I've seen from the people I've interviewed, believe it or not, I think 90% of the people cannot explain linear regression to me, the maths behind that. So to me, that shows that there's a lot of noise around machine learning understanding as of today, or data science. There are a lot of people who can just run code, who can basically run existing frameworks. They can just pick up something from Keras or TensorFlow and just run it on a new data set. But then let's say that they're getting 70% accuracy. Beyond that, they lack the intuition of how to actually fine tune the model, how to actually curate the data better, how to collect or look at the annotations, how to get basically how to clean up, how to do active learning, how to do hard negative mining, some of the other details, right, on how to improve the models and get it to 90% accuracy or sensitivity and specificity, which really matters. So I think that is where you as students can stand out by understanding the details around machine learning and deep learning, right? So I think that will really help you stand apart from others. And even when you go to do your master's or PhD, I think that is very important to look at the details and focus on understanding the details of these techniques. I would say look at linear algebra, look at optimization, try to understand the maths behind optimization, stochastic gradient descent, Monte Carlo models, all that stuff, not just deep learning, right? And again, as you get into deep learning, try to understand what it is, what are the different metrics, what are the different cost functions, right? So what is the dice coefficient, what is IOU, what is basically cross entropy, can you actually modify that for your models? So things like that, right? So trying to understand, can you build your own cost function, right? How do you build it? So actually try to do this, try to have these exercises where you go beyond programming and try to understand this and build something like that, which could be useful for domain specific applications. So as you get into the guts of the algorithms and the details, you start to appreciate the different steps which are involved, and that actually later on would give you a lot of intuition, and you can build your own frameworks you can build around your own ideas and research techniques around that. So I would strongly suggest looking at that. I think those were pretty much the questions. Unless somebody has anything in the chat, let me check that. Yeah, I think those are pretty much the questions. Any direct messages? No. Yeah, I think those were the questions. So I can skip back to presenting, and I'll go through very quickly because I think in the interest of time, if there are any general questions as well, please feel free to ask them on the open question side of things. Meanwhile, I'll present a little bit around causal inference. So what is causal inference? So typically what you would have seen in standard machine learning would be you have the dependent variable y, you have the input variables x, and then you're learning this function, right, which maps, so y equal to f of x, and you want to learn that function f, which maps y to x. So for any new x coming in or any new data points in your test set or validation set, how do you predict the y? This is typical predictive modeling, right? The causal inference goes beyond that. So, and when you do predictive modeling, you're essentially learning the correlation, how y correlates to x, right? You're not saying anything about the causality, right? So you don't know what is causing the change in y, right? So essentially, when you're looking at causal modeling, that is what you're trying to answer. So you have an intervention. So in the medical field, it could be a medicine, right? So a patient is given a certain medicine, and you look at the outcome. So it could be that the patient improves, or the patient deteriorates, or he might even die, right? Or it may have an adverse event. So the question is, are there specific medicines which have better outcomes? That's what you want to know. When a patient comes in to the hospital, you want to know what are the type of interventions, or it's also known as treatment. What are the different treatments I can give the person? Is treatment A better than treatment B in terms of outcomes? So the outcome is the y here. So the dependent variable y is the outcome. The x, or the covariates, or the input features, are the x. So it could be patient age, it could be patient history, it could be demographics, and other information which you grab from the patient. And t is the treatment, right? So this is different. So typically in a machine learning model, you have the y. So again, going back to the imaging scenario, what is your y? Your y is your labels, right? It could be cat, dog, or it could be person's face versus not face, and so on. And the input or the x's are typically the pixel values in images, or it could be basically other types of data for the patient or for the user which you're capturing. Now this, although I'm giving you this example from healthcare, this is used a lot also in the online setting, right? So companies like Google and Facebook, etc., do something called as A/B testing or multivariate testing, where typically they run these tests where they show you a certain page. So for example, on Amazon, let's say you're shopping on Amazon, you're shown a certain page and another user is shown a different page based on their preferences. And for me as a user, I may be shown page 1 versus page 2, and they try to understand which page is better for me, right? Based on the click-through rate or how I respond. So this is typically running the actual test. Now the question is, in healthcare and other places, you have a lot of observational data which you have collected historically over time. Can you mimic this? Because running an actual trial like this, or a randomized controlled trial, takes time and it's expensive. And as you're probably aware, in the clinical side, you need to run clinical trials, which are actually randomized controlled trials. And you need to enroll patients, and it takes time, and you need to follow up the patient for several months. Some of you might be aware, recently vaccines were being built for COVID, and a lot of information around running clinical trials for those, which took time and a lot of effort and money and so on, which is needed in the side of medicine. But then the question is, you have a lot of observational data. So the question is, can we use the observational data to mimic these randomized control trials? That's the question. And I'll quickly skip through this in the interest of time. And the second question is, can we use machine learning to do this? Right? So again, observational studies, if you are running basically a randomized control trial, like on the online side or even in person, it could be patient surveys and so on. It takes a lot of time, and of course that's the golden standard, but then it takes time and it takes money and effort. So can you use observational data which you've collected to actually mimic a randomized control trial? And the idea is then you have something known as causal inference, and you can use machine learning methods to do that. So I'll give you a quick example here of what the fundamental problem is here. So let's say this is an example from a different domain, and this builds around what's known as a counterfactual. So you have treatment T, and then you have the outcome, and then you have all the input features for the users. So this is an example. So let's say it's a person Kim, and let's say that person receives job training for 1 year. That's the treatment. T is treatment, and in this case, it's also called as intervention. And this is job training. And let's say 1 year later, her income is $20,000 after job training. Now the question is, what is the effect of job training on this person, right? Let's say we are not given her job training, because training takes money, right? And it takes time and money and so on. And so, what would be Kim's income if she had not received job training? And I'm telling you that her income would have been $18,000. How do you know this? Let's say I have this oracle which tells me that if Kim was not given job training, then her income would have been 18K. So the actual effect or the outcome difference between giving job training versus not giving is that difference between $18,000 and $20,000. So $2,000 is the actual improvement in Kim's life by giving job training. However, the problem is we would never know that, because you have just this one person, right? And then you can either give Kim the training or you cannot give the training to her. At the same time, you cannot do both. And this is exactly the fundamental problem which you face with causal inference. So this is another example from healthcare. This is just a toy example, but then on the left side you have multiple patients, and this is the observed data, right? So the first row you have age. This is a 40-year-old female who was given treatment. So a particular drug, let's say treatment A versus B, right? So it could be treatment versus no treatment. And they were given this treatment, which is drug A, and then you measure the blood pressure after that, 140. Similarly, for different people, could be second row is 40 male, and treatment one blood pressure was 145. Now, on the right hand side, you can see that for the same person, 40 and female, treatment 0, right? So at that time point, you could have given her the other treatment, but you didn't. You chose to give treatment 1. Now you are interested in knowing, what if I had given her the other drug? If I had given her drug B, what would her blood pressure have been if I had given her the other drug? You don't know this because you didn't do this. But can you estimate it? The question is, can you estimate it? So if you can estimate it, then you can compare the two. For the first row, you can compare the left and right panels, and then you can say, let's say her blood pressure would have been 130 after giving drug B. Then you know that comparing the two, for Kim, for this particular patient, right? So there is a difference of 10 in the BP. So giving drug B would have been better. But you don't know that. So I'm going to show you a very simple plot which will make this more clear. And again, this is a toy plot. On the x-axis you have age, on the y-axis you have blood pressure. And what you want to know are these vertical arrows, right? So the red line is for one treatment, the blue line is for the other treatment, right? And for the same individual, one individual is this vertical line. So again, this is the treatment effect you want to estimate. You can estimate the average, or this is the actual data you have. For some patients, you gave them one particular treatment, which are the red dots. For some of the other patients, you gave the blue dots, right, which is the other treatment. So treated or control, or you can say drug A versus drug B. So now is where it gets really interesting. So for some patients, like I said, you gave drug A, for some drug B. So the solid dots, either solid blue or solid red, are the actual treatments you gave and the measurements you took at the end of it, which are the outcomes. In this case, the blood pressure. What you don't know is the hollow dots, right? So for the same patient here, you don't know. So if you have the solid blue dot, you don't have the red dot for the person. You see it's in hollow. And if you have the solid red dot, you don't have the blue dot, right? So the idea is, can you actually estimate these missing data? So by missing, I mean these are basically something which you cannot actually gather by collecting more data. You have to estimate this. Because for the same person, at the same time, you can either give them drug A or drug B. You can't give them both. It doesn't make sense. So can you identify or estimate these hollow dots here? Because if you estimate these hollow dots, your problem is solved. You can take the difference between the solid and the hollow dot, and then you know basically the outcome differences for these two treatments, and then you can figure out which treatment is better. So how does this work? For new patients coming in, then basically you can estimate what is the difference in the outcomes between these two treatments and then pick the best treatment for them, right? So, and the fundamental problem is we can observe only one of those, right? On the vertical lines, you can observe either the top or the bottom, so you can't observe both. So the idea is, can you use machine learning? Typically, this is a problem which has been seen in biostatistics and economics before. And some of the simple ways to solve, or simple in the sense, some of the intuitive ways to solve this would be nearest neighbors, right? So I'll skip through some of the math because we're running out of time, but very quickly, you can use nearest neighbors. So you have these red dots and then you have some of the blue dots, and the x and y axis are the covariates or the patient features. I'm just plotting two of them. So you can say I will use nearest neighbors and pick the closest neighbor who was treated with the other treatment. So red is one treatment, blue is the other type of treatment, right? Drug A versus drug B. So I'll pick nearest neighbors and use those. However, there are some issues with that, and some of the issues is that some of the features here may not be directly correlated with outcomes. So if you just use some of the patient features to do this matching, they may not be very indicative of the actual outcomes. So what we did is modify some random forest methods for this matching, which directly correlates the outcomes or the outcome differences with basically the input features as well as the treatments. So, and my involvement here was, I was a research scientist at Stanford, so I was involved with Professors Susan Athey and Stefan Wager in building, and as well as Guido Imbens in building these models. And there is open source code as well and some papers around this. So the idea is to use random forests. So you can think of random forests as a way to determine neighbors. It's a supervised way to determine neighbors, right? So if you look at random forests very quickly, it's a forest, so it has multiple trees, and each tree is a classification or regression tree. So we modified that to build each tree, which is a causal tree. And so trees typically build these partitions which are rectangular, and when you combine multiple trees, you get basically when you average out over multiple trees, you get what's known as a random forest kernel. On the left bottom panel here, you can see that. So it's an adaptive way to build neighborhoods. So you can look at each leaf in the tree, right, as containing data points which are similar to each other. And when you combine across multiple trees, you basically get neighbors, which is a supervised way to build neighborhoods, as opposed to using Euclidean or k nearest neighbors, where it's not really adaptive to the feature space and it's not driven by the outcomes. Right, so we modified this, and basically again I'll skip through this because I only have a few minutes. And the modification is to use the treatment effect differences to split. As you build a tree from the top node, you're splitting into left and right children and so on, and you iteratively keep on splitting, right? And you have splitting rules. For classification, you have reduction in the impurity or Gini impurity or cross entropy, and then for regression, you have reduction in variance, and you keep on splitting. Similarly, we have the treatment effect here, which we're using as the cost function to split, and we build multiple trees similarly. As you split left and right, you're looking for treatment effect differences and trying to maximize those as you split, so that you have the left and right leaves the data points which go into those to have maximal differences in the outcomes between the two treatments. Yeah, I'm talking a lot of technical details. Again, I'd like to keep it high level here. So this is some of the analysis we did with using heart patient data. So data collected from 35 hospitals, 6 surgeries. So the question is, which hospital is better for which surgery? Of course, there is no generic answer, and so we would need to identify patient subgroups for whom that answer actually makes sense. So all the important patient features, doctor and hospital features were selected, and the treatment here basically, or the intervention, is one hospital versus the other. And we have the outcomes as patient surveys at the end of the surgery after a few days, which were collected. And we are comparing here just using regression trees on the left versus causal tree on the right. And if you're just doing regression, it's just picking features which correlate highly with heart disease, which is hypertension and so on the top. But that really doesn't tell you if hospital A is better than hospital B, or procedure A is better than procedure B. That's what we are interested in. On the right, if you see the causal tree, it has fewer splits as compared to the left, but many of these splits, if you see on the table here, are statistically significant here. So the bottom half of this is showing that you have fewer splits, but most of them are statistically significant, as opposed to the regression tree, which has a lot of splits for a lot of variables, but most of them are not really that's statistically significant. I'll skip through this, and yeah, if you're interested, you can look up Causal Tree on GitHub. It's an open source package to which I contributed as well. And yeah, I'll pause here again. I know I went through a lot of stuff, so I'll pause here, and again, I'll take any questions. I think we're pretty much running out of time, so I'd like to spend the last few minutes taking any questions around machine learning or in general. Anything you want to know about computer vision, machine learning, AI, happy to answer those.
So I think other questions are at the top of the scroll bar.
Oh, okay, so it's showing up in the reverse order. Okay. Let's see where I left off. Okay, occlusions pose a problem while doing object detection. How can this be combated in real life scenario? Yeah, that's again a good question. So occlusions are definitely a problem when you're looking at stereo cameras or when you have shadows and so on. I would say one straightforward way to deal with occlusions is actually have experts label shadows, because shadows are something which show up regularly when you have something in 3D, right? So you have, and sometimes you confuse shadows for dark objects in the scene. And this is actually a problem which people look at in ultrasounds, where you have shadows from the ultrasound images and you have actual cysts and so on which show up as dark regions. So if you can get experts to label that for you, that can help solve your problem to some extent. It would still be a problem if you encounter shadows which you have not looked at before. So I would say again, collecting expert annotations would definitely be helpful. You can also use some prior knowledge around where you might see shadows, and that I would call more as post processing, where you can detect a certain objects and then you have some a priori information about those, so you can look around the objects and flag certain regions as possible shadows and use that as well. So these would be two approaches which I can think of at high level, which people have used before. Again, it would be pretty domain specific for some. Okay, next question. Many professionals tag most of the research in deep learning as useless, as it is an overexploited field where the giants dominate. What are some of the solutions for doing rather useful research according to you? So again, yeah, so deep learning I think is a hyped up word, or AI is a hyped up word as of today. But there are also a lot of useful research papers coming out, so I wouldn't dismiss it. Again, I would suggest going back to the basics and learning the basics. And trying to apply it to your specific problem. So you're working at a particular company, you've been given a data set, right? So again, the person who gave it to you at the end of the day, if it's a CTO or a high level person or might be a customer, doesn't really care whether you're using deep learning or something else. Many times the problem might be solved using a linear regression model or logistic regression model. That's, I would say, just focus on understanding what type of results you need, what type of metrics you want to use. Is sensitivity something you're looking for? Is precision versus recall useful? What are the exact operating points you want to work with, and so on? And again, like I mentioned, in the real world, what are some of the typical problems you would deal with, right? So trying to build robust models in the real world, which are robust to noise, distortions, and missing data, that's always a challenge. So just using some deep learning model is not going to help you solve that problem typically. So I would say focus on that. That would be more useful, I think. Again, so trying to solve these problems with data drift, with changes in the data distribution, trying to estimate that, dealing with missing data. Typically, again, it would depend on your domain, right? So I think that would be really something which would be useful. Okay, next question. You talked about camera calibration and localization. In Carla, a self-driving robotic simulator, we use multiple checkerboards to make sure our autonomous moving car doesn't go haywire. Is there some research done to do localization without checks? So yeah, again, around the localization, people typically use Visual SLAM and there is a lot of work around that. Again, I can't get into a lot of the details given limited time. So I would say when you can use checkerboards or when you can use calibration, I would say use it, because there is no, I think, there is no great alternative to that. I would say if you can solve a problem using more hardware or more calibration charts and so on, definitely go with that. If you cannot use that, then basically try to use, for example, things like flat planes, or if you can project patterns onto that, you can use that. Because I know when you deploy these, you can't really go around carrying calibration charts. That's one of the problems. You can try to do some light calibration just to identify projective transforms and so on. And I had it on one of my slides. Basically, by just collecting information from scenes and looking at objects which are at hyper infinity, right? So then you can essentially treat that as a flat plane and then try to fit projective transforms. And you can solve for some of the camera parameters from that, mostly external calibration. If the internal parameters are changing, it would still be hard to detect them 100% because you would need the checkerboard and so on. But you can solve for some of this real time if you don't have the checkerboard. That would be my short answer. If you can use it, definitely go ahead and use the calibration chart. If you cannot use it, try to solve at least for some of these parameters, or try to at least bound some of these parameters by looking at hyperinfinity and so on in your real world scene. Okay, next question. Can the treatment affect, oops, I think I lost it. Can the treatment problem be solved using generative modeling by some data analysis in the latent space? Not really. This is something which I'm looking at. So you can't really use generative models to handle the missing data. Like I said here, so you can. I mean, the short answer is you can use generative models, but you would have to make sure you're using the right type of models which can deal with this missing data. So this missing data problem, you need to essentially match data points from the two groups, right? From the treatment and the control groups, or treatment 1 versus treatment 2, or you can have multiple treatments. So there is some work around what's known as bandits and using Bayesian modeling approaches. So you can use generative models. The short answer is yes, but not what you are thinking of, I think, typically. But yeah, there is. I mean, this is an open field of research. So you would need to modify these generative models to handle this causal inference framework. You can use Bayesian techniques. You can look at GANs as well. There is some recent work around that. But again, that's pretty involved on the mathematical side because you have to look at the convergence. You have to look at the two treatment groups and see if you are actually estimating both of those and you're matching them well when you proceed. So it is doable. I would suggest looking at some recent research papers, mainly in econometrics and machine learning, the combination of the two. And you can look at John Langford's papers at Microsoft Research. He has done a lot of work uh, over the years on this. So using multi-armed bandits, using other types of optimization models for reinforcement learning around this. Yeah, so I would suggest looking at that. Okay, so sometimes, next question, sometimes in problems there is a pool of parameters which are not directly related. Being diabetic or having an autoimmune disorder and going for a cancer detection test. How do you link such parameters and get a better prediction and less false positives? I'm not sure I completely understand the question. I would frame this as there are certain patient features which are not directly correlated with the outcome. I guess that's what your question is. How do you link such parameters? So the idea is if you do feature importance with respect to this, and again, I'm looking at some explainable models in the causal inference space. This is still an open research problem. On the machine learning side, you can do feature importance. Let's say you're predicting cancer. You might be able to detect certain features which are comorbidities. So a person may still have an autoimmune disorder, and that might actually have, or the cancer may have some effect on that, or the autoimmune disorder may have some effect on the cancer score. So it is possible that the two are related, although the doctor may not directly say that because in their training they may not have been trained to look at some of these. So I think that's where using these machine learning algorithms would be helpful because it can return beyond the simple, I would say the simple decision rules which a doctor is using. these machine learning models, if you do feature importance and so on, it can return, or it can actually identify some of these, I would say, scenarios, or some of these useful information points going beyond what the doctor's training is. So you might detect these interesting correlations between autoimmune disorders and something on the cancer grading, right, which may not be directly something the doctor has figured out in their training. So I think it's very useful, but again, this has to be used with caution also, I would say, because you may be picking up some false correlations. There may not be a causal effect at all. So the autoimmune disorder may not be causing a spike on the cancer side, right? Or it might be. So actually, determining the causal effect, you would need to run the causal model type frameworks I showed. Otherwise, it's just correlational, but even the correlational stuff could be useful because there may be a confounding factor which is triggering both the autoimmune disorder as well as cancer, right? So it's interesting to know, and I mean the machine learning model won't tell you what the confounding factor is, but there will be certain genes which are being turned on and off, which is causing both the autoimmune disorder as well as the spike in the cancer. So I would say it's still useful to do the machine learning part and look at what the interesting correlations are. Then you can go back to the domain experts, you can look at the genomics data and so on. You can talk to the oncologist if they've seen other cases which are similar. So it'll definitely be interesting to look at that. Okay, could you talk about your journey at BITS? What are some of the experiences which shaped your career? Sure. So at BITS, basically, I got interested in image analysis. I started off actually looking at trying to do video coding or image encoding for JPEG and MPEG, trying to essentially make changes to those models and trying to use some signal processing, image processing work around that. That's what really got me interested. Mainly the signal processing coursework I did, FFT, signals and systems, and basically DSP and image processing, and then information theory. So there was a course on information theory which I took in my last semester, which was really interesting, and covered Thomas and Cover and learned a lot of concepts because like I said, my background was in instrumentation, so and electronics. So we did a lot of hardware type of work, circuits, which gave me a broad understanding of electronics, but not a lot of understanding around signals and systems and the mathematics around that. So I think the interesting courses or the important courses which I think I learned from were operations research, optimization, signals and systems, the information theory and coding course, digital communication. I think many students, to be honest, tend to ignore these courses. And they try to focus on circuits because electronics, obviously, there is a lot of focus on digital electronics and the circuits, microelectronics, and so on. But if you're interested in the mathematical side of things, I would say do some maths courses as well and focus on them, pay attention because optimization is really useful in machine learning. Nobody will probably tell you that, but I think at the end of the day, if you want to build your own machine learning model or your own framework, you would need to understand those details. I would focus on that. I know as students in electronics or computer science, you don't do a lot of coursework or you don't focus a lot on continuous mathematics like differential equations, optimization, and so on. I know there is some discrete math on the CS side, but not a lot of focus on the mathematical side of things and statistics as well. So focus on that in statistics. So beyond that, I did some projects with professors and basically did read a lot of research papers. These were the days where I think it was still early days of the internet. So actually started off by looking at journals which were printed copies and then photocopying that and reading them, trying to understand. It was tough, I'll be honest, it was really tough in the beginning trying to understand all the details. But that's where I started off. Then I came to UCSD and did some coursework, early coursework, which covered the image processing details, computer vision fundamentals. And I did, so one of the things I did was actually did a lot of coursework from multiple departments. So from computer science, from bioengineering, from statistics and mathematics. So it gave me a broad understanding of different fields and what are the open problems they're looking at. So not just focus on electrical engineering or computer science. I think that's really helpful. And both undergraduate and graduate level coursework. We did a lot of machine learning coursework and a lot of parameter estimation in signal processing, which again look at parametric models, Bayesian techniques. So not just deep learning, but looking at all the different frameworks, all the different mathematical techniques around that. Not just machine learning or deep learning. Because I think a lot of statistical and parameter estimation models, for example, maximum likelihood estimation, map estimation, they deal with a lot of fundamental mathematics which are really useful even for machine learning. So I would say focus on all those and then focus on some useful research projects. Okay, so did you cold mail professors for research opportunities and possibly doing a paper, or did you approach on campus? Yeah, for my MS and PhD, I did cold mail. I also cold call several professors, and I know it's difficult again because of the time difference. If you're focusing on US and Europe, but I would suggest actually doing that, and I would suggest first starting with the on-campus faculty because they're available to you, but just making sure that you don't just work on some projects which are not interesting to you or which are not really fundamental or really useful to contributing to research. So just don't do something for the sake of it to get a certificate, right? So make sure that just try to assess if what the professor is doing on campus is useful to you or not. So try to find somebody who can really mentor you or guide you, because I think that's important. Because if the professor is just letting you do everything and you're just doing everything on your own, then there's not very good mentorship or leadership from the professor. I've seen this multiple times, unfortunately, I have to say. When I was a student as well at different universities, I mean, it was difficult to find really good mentors. I would say try to find an industry mentor as well, because that helps learn about stuff from the real world. And I think it's important to focus on applications which are useful in the real world as well. So I think a combination of the two. I think industry focuses a lot on applied problems, which is both good and bad. So it doesn't focus a lot many times on fundamental research. Only the big tech giants have the resources to focus on fundamental research. Other than that, most of the mid to small sized companies focus on applied work. If you're really interested in research, I would say try to find mentors on the academic side who can help you or who can help guide you well. So I would say, yeah, so if you can cold email, there's no harm in that, right? I mean, what's the worst? They won't reply to you, right? There's nothing beyond that. So I would say definitely try that and try to do some work on campus as well, so I would say start with that, try to do something interesting. If you can publish some research, just make your paper open source, put it on archive, make your code open source, and approach some professors with your analysis. Then, when you're actually doing the cold email, just don't send a cold email saying, "Hello, professor, I want to work with you, and I'm interested in this topic," right? Because that. So, I mean, the whole aim is to set you apart from the other students. So make sure that you essentially have done some groundwork. You've actually tried to do some analysis yourself and then put that together as a document or a paper, attach it to the email, show something interesting to the professor, and try to make sure that what you worked on is something they are working on as well, because then they would get interested. So yeah, I would say cold email, but then make sure that you try to do as much as possible to get them interested. Okay, next question. Neural nets don't have info about datasets. Uh, they have those learned parameters which are disastrously small than datasets. If you use active learning with some layers unfrozen according to Sandel, can we expect some advancements in the research? Okay, so if I understand this, I'm not sure I exactly understand the question. So if you're saying, yeah, definitely do transfer learning with layers unfrozen, yeah, that would work to some extent again. So they don't have information about the data sets. I guess what you're trying to say is they don't have a priori knowledge. That's right. So I would say try to do a combination, right? So it doesn't have to be just one deep learning model. You can use some top-down approaches. You can combine the output of that with some decision rules or some Bayesian models where you're using prior information or expert knowledge. Or some, I mean, there is a lot of work going on now on graphical models and graph neural networks, which can combine image information with other types of a priori knowledge or expert information. So try to look at those. You don't always have to use neural nets, like I said again, depends on the domain. If you just use a logistic regression model, or if you can work with a Bayesian model, that might be good enough, or that might even be better than using a neural net model for your research or for your problem. So I wouldn't just say just throw everything at a CNN and try to make it work. So it would depend on the domain, the number of data points you have, the type of prior information or prior expert knowledge you can use. That is really useful as well. So try to combine all of those. Hope I answered that. That question was a bit vague, but hope I answered that to some extent. Okay, how was your application process for masters? How did you select your school? Did masters help you differentiate into AI? Was it during your PhD? Okay, the application process. So I try to pick schools in two ways. One is try to look at professors who are doing interesting work, mainly in signal and image processing for me when I got started. And the second was would essentially would they respond? So the idea is would they respond to what I'm emailing and would they be interested, right? So I did get maybe 2 or 3 responses, and with that I applied to those universities for sure, and then some of them also said apply and then I can respond to that. So I would say it's a combination of two in terms of the research match as well as people who responded to me. So it's a combination of that. I would suggest also doing research around the type of courses which are offered at the university. If there are a lot of interesting machine learning coursework or computer vision coursework being offered as well, because that I think would be really useful to build your solid fundamentals. And I would say again, email the professors, see if any of them are interested. Typically, professors are interested for students who want to come in for PhD. So my program was an MS PhD program, so it was an MS leading to a PhD. And typically, I applied to PhD programs mostly so that professors would get interested in funding me as well as interested in responding to me. Because I was pretty clear I wanted to do a PhD. Some of you might just want to do an MS program. In that case, it might make more sense to look at the coursework, and I mean even for MS PhD it is important to look at coursework. PhD is more later on focused on the research as well. So if you're unsure, I would say apply to an MS program and then assess how the university is in terms of the research going on there. Because if you just apply for an MS program, then you would have the freedom to then change your university or your professor for the PhD. I think on the flip side, MS is typically not funded, so you would have to apply for a student loan or try to look for on-campus jobs and so on, which are obviously much harder than getting funded for a PhD. But I mean, pros and cons, right? That would give you more freedom to explore options. You can apply for MS and then look at other options for PhD. Application process was typically not easy. So yeah, it took a lot of effort, a lot of exploring different universities, narrowing them down to 8 to 10 universities. I think I applied to 8 or 9 universities at the end of the day, and I think 2 or 3 professors had responded. The other 5 were just based off of my analysis of how good the match is. I got, I think, 2 or 3 admits. I got funding, scholarship guarantees from 2 universities. So I decided to go with UC San Diego because I felt that was the best match for me uh, in terms of the research, but also looking at the weather and California and all that stuff. So yeah, that's where it was. Sir, for about a year you were at Stanford as a data scientist. I request you to please share your experience. What motivated you to leave that post and get into other organizations and institutions? Okay, just hang on for 1 second. I'll be back. Just give me one. Hello. Yeah, sorry about that. So I would say, yeah. So I moved to Stanford. It was a one-year position, and I wanted to work on some specific problems. For me, I think one of the biggest takeaways by working at Stanford, I got to work with Nobel laureates and potential Nobel laureates, and really learned a lot. And also, I think worked at the intersection of biostatistics, economics, and causal inference, machine learning. So that helped me generate a lot of my own ideas, because otherwise typically if you work in machine learning and image processing, there is a lot of other people working on similar problems, right? So it definitely helped me figure out my own research path and then work on research papers and new ideas at intersection of two different fields. So it was a great learning experience. The reason I moved on is I do like working at multiple startups where we're building some interesting projects to actually solve real world problems. That's the reason I moved on, and I'm working at Onward right now as a co-founder, because I think there's a lot of potential to do interesting work in the cancer space and pathology. Okay, next question. I'll probably take a couple more questions before we wrap up. How many so many startups and other tech giants are moving to Silicon Valley, or moving away, I guess, from Silicon Valley, but it is the hub for it's okay to fail. Do you recommend one to get into that atmosphere and, and possibly lead a startup? Yeah, so I would suggest. So I think working at a startup, you really learn a lot. So I was the first employee at more than one startup. Many of them failed. One or two have been somewhat successful. Again, not hugely successful, but I think reasonably successful in the sense some of the products we worked on is actually getting used in some hospitals and helping patients. For me, that was the motivation to begin with. Has always been my motivation to help patients and improve their diagnosis. So yeah, I would say there's always a risk. So if you're in your 20s and so on, I would, and if you don't really have a lot of responsibilities, I would suggest, yeah, go ahead, join a startup, because you'll learn a lot. If you want a comfortable life, then join a big company, because yeah, you have job security, you have a good amount of money. But if you want to really learn a lot and get challenged, you definitely join a startup. But possibly lead a startup. Yeah, to lead a startup, I would suggest you need some experience. So I would suggest working in some big companies and or universities, as well as multiple startups as an engineer, and then I would suggest leading, because you need to pick up a lot of skills and experience before you can just go and lead a startup. Otherwise, you will end up making mistakes, rookie mistakes, which you don't want to make. So it's better you learn from mistakes other people make instead of you making the same mistakes and learning from that. So I would suggest first go and work in an interesting startup or consult for one. Try to understand how the startup world is. Also work, if possible, at big companies for a couple of years, for a few years, at a university, do some research. So you have understanding, nuanced experience and understanding across these different sectors, right? Universities work in a certain fashion. They do a lot of fundamental research. They're typically slow, but then you learn a lot eventually. And I would definitely suggest at some point in your career you should do some academic research, because that helps you really think deeply. Companies, you typically tend to solve problems which are applied, and I would say, I mean, yeah, I might be biased, but I would call them superficial. I'm not really trying to put down the work done in companies, but yeah, I think I have a bias in terms of the academic rigor. I think, yeah, working at universities really helps you do some fundamental research. But then I think the useful thing with working at companies is actually you see a lot of your work going into products which people are using, right? So that really has a lot of motivation as well. So I would suggest doing a few years in at least a big company, maybe a couple of years, maybe a university with some research. And then I would say working as an engineer at a startup. Or if you can do it in parallel, that's great. If you have some ideas, I mean, startup has a lot of different things which need to come together for it to be successful. It's not just a technical idea, right? You need to be at the right place at the right time. You need to get funding. You need to get investors on board, and more importantly, you need to get customers who are willing to pay for your product. So there's a lot of different moving components. It's not just engineering. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot of things to learn. It's very exciting. So at some point in your life, I think you should be involved in a startup. But again, it's your priority, right? And then your family situation and so on. So again, if you want to have some savings and comfort, which is important in life. So I would suggest working for a big company, building your savings, and also getting the experience, right, and learning the technical aspects. In a big company, you don't have to worry about where your next paycheck comes from, so you can focus on technical work. So I would suggest doing that for some time, and then you have some experience. Then you can move on to building your own startup, or you can work as an engineer at some exciting startups which have some decent funding, and then after that you can start maybe thinking about your own ideas. I would think you need a few years of experience to think of your own ideas and to lead a startup. So yeah, I would go that way. What are some ways to approach you? You can connect with me on LinkedIn or email me. I'm happy to help in any way I can. Yeah, I think yeah, my email is my first name dot last name, so vikas.ramachandra@gmail.com. So you can just email me there. Happy to help in any way I can, or connect with me on LinkedIn. It's easy to find me there. What are some of the ways to approach you? I already took that. So how do you keep your product away from venture capital? Okay. Again, I don't completely understand the question, because venture capital is both. I mean, there are pros and cons. VCs do help a lot of startups with funding and connects, and with the market and so on as well, in terms of getting customers. So I think maybe there's a lot of bad press around VC money. I don't think that's 100% true. VCs can be very helpful as well. They're not just there to take hold of your startup, as you would probably see in maybe some of the TV shows and so on, or in popular media. Yeah, I mean, just running your own startup without any funding is very challenging as well. And most startups, 99%, are not very lucky in terms of getting early customers, and you can't just survive on revenue. So definitely, I think working with VCs is interesting, and also to some extent can be challenging, but also they do provide a lot of help and connects and infrastructure support and funding, of course. There are pros and cons with everything. So yeah, I think that question probably, I think it's more nuanced in just saying that don't work with them. You can work with them and get a lot of positives as well. Yeah, I think we're pretty much coming to the end of time here for the talk. So if there are no other questions, I would like to stop here. We wait another minute, and if there are no other questions, you can always feel free to connect with me and continue the conversation on LinkedIn or via email and so on. And most of my work, you can find it online. At least the papers are open source. Yeah, looks like there are no further questions. So thank you, everyone. And yeah, if the organizers have anything to share,
It was a really wonderful talk, sir. We enjoyed a lot, and being a computer vision researcher myself, I really found it very insightful.
yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. I hope everyone found it useful to some level at least. But yeah, thanks a lot. So, okay, let's see one more question. Is there any chance you will be launching a product in India? Actually, this company I'm working at, Onward, is based both in India and US. So we have actually launched in India. We have some telemedicine products which are being used even for COVID. So on the mobile COVID buses and so on, it is actually being used by the government. Some of our analysis tools for analyzing COVID tests. We also have some telepathology solutions which are being used by some big diagnostic labs in India. Yes, I mean Onward Assist. Yes. Okay. Great. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye bye.
Sir, we would like to see you at the lounge. If there are more questions, people will ask in the lounge itself.
Okay, sure. So should I move to the launch?
Yes, sir.
So just